Ja, hallo.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for being here. So we imagined this to be a lot smaller, to be honest, but we're really flashed by so much interest in our session. This is Annika. My name is Natascha. Why are we here today? We're not here for the fun and party part. We'll talk about fascism. We like talking about fascism, actually, even though it's a sad topic, because it's just a very big issue to us, and there's a lot of movement in the scene at the moment. We're seeing collective movements on different topics that, importantly, aren't limited to single countries, but are networked globally. So we don't have single country fascist movements running in parallel, but they're networking across borders. And there's something brewing that is really problematic. And this is why we would like to put a spotlight on single groups within this fascist network. And with this, I will give the floor to Annika, who will present one of those groups. Yeah, exactly. That was the idea of this talk, to give you an overview of the right-wing stakeholders and the most important people there. And one of the most important groups is the neo-right, that includes different denominations and belief systems. And even though my book is based on America, it's not a US-specific problem. We can see in Europe, for example, we see the same in Poland, in Hungary. The CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, just took place. That's a very important right-wing conference. It took place for the very first time in Hungary, which is an important signal that shows us that even though there's single nationalistic project, that this isn't an isolated phenomenon, but that they're networked. And especially the religious right. So this is where the American example comes in, because the religious right is very strong there, and also has a very sophisticated infrastructure. So since its beginning in the 60s or 70s, this movement has always had the goal to become international and to network internationally. So if this is surprising to any of you, that there's movements like that from the right wing in the US, if it surprised you that they were pro-Putin positions, they quickly realized that this is not something you communicate and that reflects well on you. But it started with the downfall of the Soviet Union, actually, where right-wing nationalists went to Russia and started building networks, started founding organizations that decidedly were focused on international networking. And at the same time, you can see at events like CPAC that groups are mixing and are communicating with each other. That includes German stakeholders, for example. David Keller was a guest speaker at CPAC. So we see single individuals from the alt-right. And Orban even said, this is your new intellectual home here in Hungary. And at the same time, you also see representatives of Natascha's focus group, the radicalized conservatives. Yeah, a lot is happening on the extreme right spectrum. And it also covers a range of topics. But it's not just the traditional right-wing extremists like the folkish movements we know from history. What we've seen and what I describe in my book is that within the conservative parties, there are single wings that take over strategies we only knew from the right-wing extremists, like for the far-right extremists. So suddenly we have those movements within more established parties that are using the same tools the right-wing extremists are. Of course, you know this from the US, but also in Great Britain with Boris Johnson, and also in my home country in Austria, under Chancellor Kurz, and after his chancellery, conservative parties are deconstructing the status quo. They want to destabilize the political system, destroy it, in order to establish authoritarian solutions. And that is a huge problem, because we know the extreme right. It's even represented in parliament, in our parliaments, but conservative parties are heading in that direction as well, and that's a problem. And the biggest problem is that it's working, and it has worked, as you can see in Austria. Even though Kurz is gone now, the political system remains broken, and there's a lot of holes in the rule of law and democracy. And the conservative right-wing movement of parties that are involved in the culture clash of the extreme right are an important piece in this turn we are seeing, but there's many pieces to this puzzle. And what is important to us is you don't have to see the connections. Maybe the connections aren't even visible yet. Maybe they are even competing with each other. But we live in volatile, dynamic times, and we can see alliances that we didn't believe were possible before. Right-wing extremism, authoritarian responses are always responses to crises. It's always a supposed solution for a crisis. And we're living in times of crises and interlapping crises. And there aren't only solitary solutions to those crises or solution proposals. The heavier the crises, the more authoritarian the proposed answers. One of those crises is the climate crisis. It's been denied by certain parties for a long time, but we're seeing a different narrative being built here. Yes, and it's a change that has come really quickly. When you look at the last few terrorist attacks from right-wing perpetrators internationally, and when you compare them, most younger attackers had an eco-fascist agenda. And that may sound strange because of environmental conditions that you wouldn't connect that to right-wing agendas. But if you look closely, environment protection has always been instrumentalized by right-wing parties and right-wing politicians. And there's also the eugenics debate, and I think it's important when sticking with terrorists. This is an extreme example, but it works like a magnifying glass. You can see what is happening within the extreme right. Just a few years ago, at the terrorist attack in Utøya by Anders Breivik, you could read his manifesto about climate change being a communist manifesto, and this is the usual, from right-wing conservative groups. And with some of the younger attacks, this has been different. They argue with the climate crisis. So there's a point that has been surpassed, and that's the danger generally for right-wing conservative movements, that they reach a point where climate change denial doesn't work for them anymore, where the climate change impacts that we're already realizing and that will increase, they've become so enormous that there's no more denying them. So you can't sell that strategy. And then we have the danger that eco-fascist narratives are created, where on the one hand, the real threat from climate change is combined with counter-migration narratives. So people are telling us climate refugees want to take over Europe. So this is a new twist on the old rhetoric that we've seen about migrants and refugees before. But it's now become openly fascist because it has to do with notions of blood and the ground and the land where you belong to. So saying that ethnic groups have a right to a certain country, and right-wing extremists even talk about white Europe and Christian Europe and combine that. And experts are afraid that this narrative that you're already seeing with this Europe being and we're seeing influence on the communist movement, and this is a radicalizing moment.
And ecofascism is added to this. From the point when the climate crisis is no longer denied, it turns around, and we're seeing this in the extreme right. And that is the argument that, well, we can't do anything against it either. And when you reach that position that you can't do anything, that you say you shouldn't also, then it's all about distribution. Who will survive and who won't? And that's the kind of game that the extreme right loves to play. And the game then is all about Europe. White Europe has to survive. And whatever happens to anyone else, in the best case, doesn't matter. And in the worst case, it is there's an active suicidal thought. And that is linked to the fact that these eco-fascist thoughts are obsessed with overpopulation. All the crises that exist are linked with the number of people on the planet, and those that are too many are always the others, and they then have to be eliminated, either through actively letting them die, denying any help, and that's a very short step to take, and actively contributing to that happening. And that is the threat in this climate crisis. If you reach that kind of end game, thinking that it's basically over and it's all about which 500 million people might survive, and that, of course, has to be Europe then. So this eco-fascist thinking does go that far. It's about birth rates. The manifests that terrorists write strongly have this point about birth rates, that there is a great exchange because those others, the wrong ones, that are not white, but also the poor ones, which we had in the books by German ex-social democrat Theo Sarrazin. So the good ones, the white ones, the decent ones, the civil ones, whatever, they are having too few children. And again, and of course, it's a double accusation of women then, because the women are not, they are taking part in that great exchange, and the women that are to be protected don't have enough children because they're kind of influenced by communist thoughts and giving all the wrong ideas. So there's a double accusation here, double blaming. So there's a very deep misogyny and anti-feminism here embedded. And that can mix quickly with the China crisis, the climate crisis, anti-queer thoughts, anti-Semitism, because that exchange thinking, of course, contains a lot of anti-Semitist stereotyping. And above this is that great exchange that is on both sides of the Atlantic, an active thought on both sides. Yes. And this kind of conspiracy narrative exists in various variants. First, there's the very open one, hard right extreme neo-Nazi position, the myth of the white genocide, or which right-wing conservatives like to use and make acceptable. That's the great replacement. We know this as, in German, under the term Umvolkung. Repopulating would be a translation. So these are keywords where you should listen. And behind that, and the anti-Semitic aspect here is important there too, because that entails the idea that there is a plan by some secret small elite which to the white Christian population, well, this kind of repopulating narrative doesn't use it that much as the white genocide narrative. The sense that these elites want to exchange a population, and that is why the neo-Nazis that were marching in Charlottesville some time ago shouted, "Jews will not replace us." That's what they meant. And I think many media reports neglected this aspect, that conspiracy theory that was behind that slogan. And when it comes to the white genocide variant, it's not just about exchanging the population, the rightfully the population that's white Christian and rightfully present, not just exchanged, but actually killed. And that narrative has spread. It's not completely new. We've had it for about 120 years, in fact, and it has a much longer colonial prehistory. The fear of slave uprisings is involved there. But there are various books that put this into a literary form, at least popularizing it at least in some circles. There are some books that are only popular in neo-Nazi das Heerlager der Heiligen, the Holy Ones Camp. So that involves one of the holy figures of American conservatism, William Buckley, and that's why it's so important to look at these narratives and to see how they relate to other events, refugee movements through climate change. And the important issue here is that link to resources and who ethnically has the right to access certain resources. The book title previously mentioned is The Camp of the Saints, by the way. And there are examples where we can see this. One example from the US, where we have an acute scarcity of baby formula. And this is about babies who either cannot digest mother's milk, or where the people that have had the child cannot or don't want to breastfeed. And then an American politician, I think 2 weeks ago, I've lost all sense of time with the pandemic. I'm sorry. So this politician tweeted an image of a pallet of baby formula, and next to it another image of empty supermarket shelves. And she wrote, not a direct quote, but she wrote something along the lines of, here in the ICE facility, which is the storage facility for the illegal immigrants, these are the people that get the baby formula, and the American babies, they have nothing left. And that, within a few hours, led to Fox News reporting, of course, and the banner on Fox News was American babies first. So this is just about what we talked about. Who gets the resources and who doesn't? It's not yet an active reduction of access for certain parts of the population by killing them, but it's the acceptance of people dying for certain groups, in this case babies and small children, because they don't have the right color of skin.
Das wird für die Zukunft das Entscheidende.
That will be decisive in the future. Resources becoming scarce and the fight for those resources. And the authoritarian answers that are so easily drifting into fascist thinking, they lead legitimacy. So when people say, these guys are letting babies die, that thought will not be popular with hardly anyone, almost anyone. But if their narrative is, these people want to exchange us, and this is then an act of self-defense, it's just us fighting back against an aggressor that is somewhere, this diffuse, anonymous, dark mass that wants to exchange us. And by describing it this way, the conspiracy narrative is immediately involved, because it's them that want to exchange us. They're anonymous, they sometimes are given a face. George Soros, for example, when it comes to migration movements, Bill Gates on the vaccination issue, where again the purported plan was that that the whites should be made weaker. But that, of course, is a traditional tool, a strategy that's over 100 years old, just the modern variant of it. And we recognize these conspiracy narratives since, well, a long time, but
so genau weiß man es nicht.
This one is from 1904, maybe 1905, maybe from the Tsarist Secret Service.
Im damaligen russischen
In the
Zarenreich.
then Tsarist Empire in Russia, because they used these so-called protocols of the Zion, and again the idea was just as it works today. So the claim was that some secret protocols were found, and the narrative was that certain Jewish families meet on a Prague cemetery to make it even more dark, and all the others, these Jews that are not us, are dividing the world between them. And with the whole purpose of damaging the European population. And that is why every single act is an act of self-defense. Every act against us becomes an act of self-defense. And that is what we see today. This is 115 years old, or a bit more than that. And it really sounds strange, but it went viral, as we would say today, at the time. It took a few years back then. It was translated into various languages. It was passed on into English, by the way. It was translated by a certain Mr. Ford, who was a great fan of the protocols of the Zion.
Diese Schrift, die Protokolle der Weisen von Zion, sind eine Legitimation.
This story of the protocols of the elders of Zion is one of the big narratives. It's actually one of two books in Austria that are not allowed to be printed. The other is Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. And I think the legal situation in Germany is similar. So If we see this parallel of things 115 years ago and now, where people are again talking about a group of evil people that want to do something, and dark powers that we have to fight back against, then, well, history repeats itself. You can see which kind of mixture is being put together. And yes, it is a problem. It's a problem.
Definitely is a problem. And I think especially the fake protocols of the Elders of Zion, the fakeness, there's another example that shows how far the individual parts of that, or what is being derived from it, go far or went far into the middle of the civic society. So a narrative that is derived from this protocol of the Elders of Zion is, taking the example of the US, but you can also see it internationally, so that the Black civil rights movement, that Black people are instrumentalized by this small Jewish elite that pull the strings, and that the civil rights movement is basically a Trojan horse that the Jewish elite is using to bring communism to the USA. And derived from that, there are different single narrative. For example, cultural Marxism is one of those narratives that you exclusively hear of in right-wing extremist groups. And now I've said this goes into the middle of the civic society. This isn't the civic society, but I think there's one breed that few people know, and that I only got to know doing research from my book, and that is political correctness. This term has been replaced by wokeness today, but political correctness used to fill the newspapers in Germany as well, and doesn't that lead us into dictatorship of opinions? You've all read it. But this term of political correctness was actually coined in the 90s by representatives of the religious rights in the USA. There was a documentation, Political Correctness, the Frankfurt School. I can't recommend watching it. You have to put documentation into massive quotes. So it was argued that political correctness was a result of cultural Marxism. And 99% of those who use this term to discuss it may not know this. But the problem is that concepts like that, through the use of terms like that, are introduced into everyday dialogue in spaces that are not exclusively right-wing extremist, or that are decidedly non-extremist. And this is why I have to pay close attention to what else is introduced here, but because it's hardly only ever the term that is introduced. All right, we've got 10 minutes left. We treated different aspects and narratives. Now the big question is, I started this talk with talking about puzzle pieces that in the future might develop into a big project, because fascism is always a big project, never forget that. Now, what is fascism. It's not funny, but I'm still laughing. No, it's really not funny. But what does it look like in the 21st century? I think we streamed about 3 or 4 hours about this already. What is fascism and which variants are there? Can you call it fascism or is it fascist to it? And I think there isn't one definition of fascism. There's different definitions that can be combined, that sometimes contradict each other. I think what is important when thinking about that is not to make the mistake of sticking to one fascism definition that only fits the last century. Even though what happened under the Nazi regime is unique, historically speaking, you can't forget that National Socialism doesn't equal fascism. Back then, there was already different competing fascist movements. I think you can summarize it with a few characteristics that we agreed on. Natascha is the better expert here. Yeah, it's very important what she said, and I like to repeat it also again in front of Austrian and German audiences alike. National Socialism is not enough as a definition of fascism. This is bigger. It's bigger school of thinking and ideological family. And it's not enough to look at the historical perspective. There were fascist projects in all of Europe during the time of National Socialism. Some were competing, some had less resources, but there was hardly a democratic country in Europe. You have to look very hard in the 20s and 30s of the last century where there wasn't a very strong fascist movement. This includes Great Britain, for example. So you can't explain it only from the historical perspective of one country. It has to do with exterior influences. And there's many ways you can understand fascism as a school of thinking, as a practice. But the circumstances are also so important. And those circumstances are crises, societal crises, political crises, humanitarian crises, because fascism is an authoritarian proposed solutions to crises. Fascism, in its whole construction, offers something attractive in a crisis, and that is clarity. Fascism is clarity. It's clear who is bad, who is good, who has to go, and even if you're one of the good ones, when you're one of the supposedly good ones, this is a great offer. But we can't only look at history, we have to look ahead. Because fascism is a nationalistic project by its definition. Roger Griffin and so on. We can look at all the theory, but what does that mean in a time where we have transnational movements? Even within the new right, the identitary movement they've given up this notion of Europe as a cultural space. So let us not overlook that fascism may not appear in the same fashion in the 21st century than it did in the 20th century. And maybe this may be controversial, but maybe it will not be along nationalist or national borders. It's maybe interesting to think of fascism as a project of power. And power in the 20th century meant national states because all the power was with the national state. But is that still the case in the 21st century? I believe not. There are entities that have more power than states, and that are companies, big corporations, that act as pseudo-states. And there's one fraction within the capital, and these moving times are also very interesting because the capital is not a monolithic block. And Wall Street capital is actually declining in favor of what were often called the tech bros, the tech billionaires, so the Peter Thiels of this world. It's not by coincidence that someone like Peter Thiel is one of the biggest donors of the Republican Party at the moment. And I think that's another aspect you should keep in mind when talking about fascism and neo-fascism. We often make the mistake to assume that fascism as an ideology is logical within itself. No, it's not. It's never been. And today we're seeing that some prominent figures of the political right in the tech area, such as Peter Thiel, are connecting with one another. They're communicating. They're exchanging about political ideologies. They're looking into traditionalism. And that is why you should keep a close eye on the tech world. And because it becomes very interesting when it's about AI and optimizing people, that's a huge potential. There's a potential to use the Volkisch approach here, if that's the goal. And I think, similarly to the climate crisis, Silicon Valley has long been associated with the left and the libertarian movement because they seemed so open and woke and urban. And you can't forget that many of the ideological approaches of the Silicon Valley are based on right-wing movements, even though those people might not like it or might not be aware of it. Of course, Peter Thiel is aware of it. He knows what he's doing. But this is another example of a transnational project with very influential donors that have a lot of plans. Now, my task for the last minute would be to steer the boat in the different direction and make a positive outcome. So we've put a lot of spotlights on different movements that are not really in contact, maybe, but it can be very fast. In the 21st century, you can't wait until the big project has been established. Okay, half a minute left to make it positive. But the good aspect is, even though it's difficult and it's going to be really sticky, the future is still open, and it needn't be like that. It needn't be authoritarian. It needn't become terrible. It can become good, and it must become good, and it's good to fight for that. Thank you.